I was 19 when they told us the exercise would be routine. A night navigation drill on the edge of the city. No civilians, no live fire, no surprises. That was a lie. We were police recruits, 6 of us, moving through abandoned industrial ground with our radios turned low and our nerves stretched thin. The city sounded wrong that night. Metal shifted without wind. Dogs went silent. Even the train seemed to slow. Then we heard something breathing in the dark. It was not an animal sound. It was patient, controlled, close enough that I could hear it matching our pace. Training teaches you to name your fear so you can control it. I tried to call it stress. I tried to call it exhaustion. But when the ground began to tremble under slow, deliberate footsteps, I knew we were no longer training. What happened next was never written into any report, but every one of us swore to the same thing. We were attacked by a werewolf. If you are listening right now, stay with this story until the end, because it only gets worse from here. Subscribe and tell me in the comments what story you want to hear next. Another police case or something even darker. The training ground was not officially abandoned, but everyone who worked there treated it as if it were already forgotten by the city. Because the factories that once fed it had shut down years earlier, the rail lines were rusted into stillness, and the floodlights that remained flickered more out of habit than purpose, casting long, unstable shadows that made every piece of broken machinery look like it was waiting to move. We arrived just after sunset, unloaded from the transport truck in silence, because none of us wanted to be the one who admitted that the place felt wrong before we even stepped onto the wet ground. And our instructor made a point of reminding us that hesitation was weakness, that fear was something civilians felt, not police recruits who were expected to learn control under pressure. The exercise was simple on paper, which should have been the first warning, because simplicity often hides what no one wants to explain out loud, and we were told we would split into 2 groups, navigate the perimeter, maintain radio contact, and regroup near the old loading docks before midnight, at which point the night would be considered a success, and we would be driven back with nothing more than sore feet and bruised pride. I remember adjusting my jacket and noticing how quiet the area had become as soon as we stepped away from the truck, because even the background noise of the city seemed to fade, leaving only the sound of our boots pressing into damp gravel and the occasional metallic creak of a structure cooling after a long day of artificial heat. As we moved deeper into the site, I kept catching the sensation that something was watching us from beyond the reach of the lights, not in the vague, paranoid way recruits are warned about, but with the unsettling certainty that comes when instinct recognizes attention before the mind can rationalize it away. And every time I turned my head, I saw nothing but darkness thick enough to feel solid. The first sound that truly broke our focus came from the tree line bordering the property, where the industrial ground surrendered abruptly to untamed growth. And it was not loud, dramatic, or violent, but instead a low shifting noise, like weight being carefully repositioned, as if something large was testing the ground before committing to movement. One of the recruits laughed under his breath and muttered that it was probably a deer, but his voice lacked conviction, and I noticed how none of us responded with agreement, because the sound carried a deliberateness that did not match panic or flight, and whatever made it did not run when our lights swept the edge of the trees. Radio chatter picked up after that, instructors checking in more frequently than before, their voices clipped and controlled, and though they never said anything was wrong, the way they repeated our positions told me they were tracking something beyond our progress, something they did not want to name. By the time we reached the midpoint of the route, the air felt heavier, thicker, as if the night itself was closing ranks around us, and that was when we heard the breathing, slow and steady, close enough that I could hear the faint wet rasp at the end of each inhale, a sound no animal should have made without revealing itself. We stopped moving then, 6 recruits standing in a loose formation, lights scanning uselessly through darkness, all of us aware that whatever was out there had chosen not to hide anymore. The instructors ordered us to continue the exercise, and even now I cannot say whether that command came from arrogance, denial, or fear of admitting that something had gone wrong. But the moment we began moving again, I felt a shift in the air behind us, as though the space we had just occupied was immediately claimed by something unseen. We tried to maintain formation because discipline was all we had left to cling to, but the breathing followed us with an intelligence that made my skin crawl, matching our pace without effort, never rushing, never falling behind, and always staying just far enough back to remain unseen. When the first scream cut through the night, it did not come from an animal or from the darkness beyond the lights, but from one of our own. A sharp, involuntary sound ripped from a throat that had just realized how small the rules of training were compared to what was unfolding around us. I turned in time to see a shadow detach itself from the tree line, rising rather than stepping forward, unfolding upward with a mass and height that shattered every instinct I had for scale. Because this thing was not low to the ground like a predator meant to run, but upright and deliberate, moving with the confidence of something that knew it had already won. The floodlight caught it for half a second, just long enough to register details my mind would spend years trying to forget. The broad shoulders hunched forward, the elongated arms ending in hands that did not look shaped for tools or weapons, and the head, God help me, the head, which carried the unmistakable structure of a wolf stretched unnaturally over a human frame. Someone fired into the air, not to hit it but to assert reality, to force the night to obey rules again, and the sound echoed uselessly off rusted steel, doing nothing to slow the thing that was now closing the distance with terrifying patience. It did not charge, and that was what broke something inside me, because animals charge when they are afraid or desperate, and this creature moved like a hunter conserving energy, stepping forward with the calm assurance that escape had already been calculated and dismissed. When it lunged, it did not go for the loudest or the nearest, but for the one who froze, the recruit whose training failed him in the exact way training never accounts for, and the impact sent both of them crashing out of the light and into the dark beyond, followed by sounds I still cannot describe without feeling sick. The rest of us ran, not because we were ordered to, but because survival overrode obedience in a way no instructor could undo. And as we scattered across the industrial yard, I realized with absolute clarity that the exercise was over. The rules were gone, and whatever had stepped out of the trees had been waiting for us long before we ever arrived, and it was not finished. We did not regroup the way we were trained to regroup, because training assumes that the threat is human, predictable, and limited by fear of consequences. But that night, the only thing that held us together was the sound of each other's breath and the frantic scrape of boots on wet ground as we ran through a maze of broken concrete, twisted fencing, and half-collapsed structures that turned every direction into a dead end. I remember looking back once, just once, and seeing nothing but darkness, which should have comforted me, but instead made my stomach drop, because I could still hear it moving behind us, not crashing through debris like a bear or a man, but stepping as if it knew every piece of ground that would not betray its weight. And the calm precision of that movement was worse than any scream. We reached a maintenance road that cut through the property like a scar, and two recruits stopped under a failing light to radio the instructors, their hands shaking as they tried to keep their voices steady. Because there is a particular humiliation that comes with fear when you are supposed to be becoming law, and I could hear it in the way they tried to describe what we had seen without sounding insane. The response came back in short bursts, clipped and irritated, as if our panic was inconvenient, and we were ordered to hold position, to stop running, to identify ourselves, to wait for pickup. And even then, even as my mind screamed that waiting was death, part of me wanted to obey, because obedience is a kind of shelter when the world stops making sense. Then one of us said the missing name out loud, the recruit who had frozen, the one taken into the dark, and the moment his name entered the air, the light above us flickered hard enough to dim, as if something had moved between us and the sky, and all four of us who remained felt the same instinctive certainty that we had been found again. The breathing returned, closer now, not behind us anymore but to our left, and when we swung our lights toward it, the beams landed on nothing but a stretch of chain-link fence and an empty strip of weeds, yet the sound continued, steady and intimate, as if it were coming from inside the fence, from inside the very air. One recruit raised his flashlight higher, hands trembling, and I saw his mouth moving as he counted his breaths the way they taught us during stress drills, and I remember thinking that he looked like a child trying to pretend he was a man, which was cruel but true, because we were all still boys dressed in authority. The first sign that our environment was no longer neutral came from the fence itself, where the metal began to rattle with small controlled taps, not from wind but from something touching it, moving along it, testing it like a musician testing strings. And that was when our lights finally caught a shape, not fully revealed but suggested. A tall mass behind the mesh, shoulders higher than a man's, head angled downward, eyes reflecting light without glowing, eyes that looked too focused to belong to an animal. One of us shouted, not a command, not a warning, but a raw, desperate sound that carried more honesty than any police training ever allowed. And the thing responded by moving, not away, but closer. And when it stepped into the light, I saw the outline of fur along the neck and arms. I saw the wrongness of the proportions, the long forearms ending in hands that bent slightly, as if the joints had been reshaped, and I saw its mouth open just enough to reveal teeth that looked too clean for something that lived in woods or streets. We ran again, and as we ran I heard the instructors' voices on the radio calling our names with a tone that had shifted from annoyance to alarm, which told me they could finally hear what we had been hearing. And that knowledge did not comfort me, because it meant the lie was collapsing, and whatever was out there was no longer just our nightmare. It was becoming theirs too. We reached the loading docks near midnight, not because we navigated well, but because the property seemed to funnel us there, because every route that felt like escape curved back toward the docks, as if the place itself were steering us into a corner. And when we stumbled into the open yard, we found the instructors already waiting, standing beside the transport truck with their flashlights raised and their faces set in a hard expression that tried to look like control. They demanded explanations in the language of authority, asking what we saw, asking who fired, asking why formation broke, and we tried to answer. But our answers sounded like madness even to our own ears, because describing something impossible turns your voice into a confession, and no one wants to confess to seeing a monster while wearing a uniform. One instructor grabbed my shoulder and turned me toward the tree line, telling me to point, telling me to show him where it happened. And when I lifted my arm, it shook so badly that I had to steady it with my other hand. And as I pointed into the darkness, I realized how easily the night could swallow truth, because without the creature present, the story became just words, and words can be dismissed. The missing recruit's name was spoken again, louder now, with anger threaded through it, as if anger could summon him back, and the instructor's order to search, which should have been the moment I felt relief, because help had arrived and procedure was taking over. But instead I felt dread deepen, because procedure requires belief, and belief was the one thing I could see slipping away from the faces around me. 2 instructors took one direction, 2 recruits were ordered to stay with the truck, and I was told to follow along the edge of the yard with a flashlight and keep my radio on. And as we moved, I noticed something that made my mouth go dry, because the ground near the docks was marked with prints. Deep impressions in mud that looked like a wolf's track, only stretched larger, heavier, with toe spacing that suggested a weight no dog should carry. And those prints did not come from the trees toward the yard, but from the yard toward the trees, as if the thing had already walked among us before we ever ran. We found the first piece of evidence near a pile of collapsed pallets, where a strip of uniform fabric was snagged on a nail, and one instructor held it up between 2 fingers as though it might contaminate him. And in the weak light, I saw dark staining along the edge, thick and dried, and I watched the instructor's jaw tighten as he folded it away without saying what it was. Further in, near the border where industrial ground met weeds, we found a hat, the missing recruit's training cap, flattened and dirty, and beside it were drag marks that cut a line through the mud toward the tree line. And the sight of that simple straight line broke me more than the attack itself, because it translated the impossible into a physical reality that could not be argued with. The instructor made a call on the radio that I could not fully hear, his back turned, voice low, and when he returned he did not tell us we were going to find the missing recruit. He told us we were going to return to the truck, and the suddenness of that decision felt like betrayal, because it meant that whatever command came through that radio had not been about rescue. It had been about control. As we walked back, I looked at the instructors differently, and I saw fear in them too. Not fear of punishment or paperwork, but fear of something they recognized, something they had heard about before, something that made them decide that the safest outcome was not the truth, but silence. When we reached the truck, one instructor told us that what we experienced would be described as a training accident, that there would be an investigation, that we would keep our mouths shut, and that if we spoke about a werewolf, we would destroy our futures. and the department with it. And I remember standing there under the flickering floodlight, mud on my boots, blood not yet dried under my fingernails from helping one recruit who had fallen, and realizing that the real terror was not only the creature in the dark, but the certainty that the institution I trusted was already preparing to erase what happened. And somewhere beyond the trees, something breathed slowly, as if it was listening to every word. The official explanation arrived before the sun did, delivered in calm, measured tones by men who had not been there but who spoke as if certainty could be manufactured simply by repeating a version of events often enough. And we were told that the missing recruit had panicked during the exercise, become disoriented, and run into restricted terrain where an industrial accident was likely responsible for his injuries, which was a story so thin it felt insulting, yet heavy enough with authority that no one challenged it out loud. We were taken to a small administrative building near the edge of the property, where the smell of old coffee and disinfectant mixed in a way that made my stomach turn, and one by one we were separated, questioned, and reminded that shock can cause hallucinations, that fear can reshape memory, and that young men under stress often exaggerate what they think they saw. And every time someone said that word, exaggerate, I felt something tighten in my chest, because exaggeration implies a kernel of truth twisted by imagination, and what we had experienced did not feel twisted, it felt precise. When my turn came, I sat across from an officer whose uniform carried more years than my entire life, and he listened without interrupting as I described the breathing, the shape, the way it moved, and when I finished, he leaned back and asked me whether I had ever heard of mass hysteria. And the way he said it made it clear that this was not a question but an exit ramp he expected me to take. I refused it, quietly, because even then I understood that accepting that explanation would mean accepting that my own senses could no longer be trusted. And the officer's eyes narrowed just slightly as he wrote something down and told me that grief and fear do strange things to young men, especially when one of their own goes missing. And that was the moment I realized he did not believe our fellow recruit was missing anymore. He believed the problem had already been contained. The body was found later that morning at the edge of the tree line, or rather, what they called a body was found, because what we were allowed to see bore only enough resemblance to a person to make identification possible, and even then, it was done quickly, quietly, and without ceremony, as if lingering might invite questions no one wanted to answer. They said he had been mauled by a wild animal, likely a large dog or a pack that wandered in from outside the city. And when I heard that explanation, my hands began to shake because I had grown up around dogs. I knew their violence and their panic, and nothing I saw on that stretcher resembled the work of animals acting out of hunger or fear. The wounds were too deliberate, too focused, as if the thing that made them understood anatomy well enough to disable without hesitation. And I noticed how the officers handling the stretcher avoided looking too closely, how they kept their eyes fixed on procedure, on straps and wheels and radios, anything but the reality inches away from them. We were dismissed before noon with instructions not to speak to the press, not to contact the family, and not to discuss the incident among ourselves. And as we stood in the parking lot waiting for rides home, I looked at the remaining recruits and saw the same expression reflected back at me. The expression of people who had been shown something they were never meant to see and then ordered to forget it. That night, alone in my room, I replayed the sounds over and over in my head. The breathing, the footsteps, the way the thing had chosen its target. And what frightened me most was not the memory of the attack, but the creeping realization that whatever killed our fellow recruit had done exactly what it intended to do, and that the response it triggered was just as calculated. Because monsters do not need to hide when people are willing to lie for them. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of interviews, paperwork, and silence, and though we were technically still recruits, the way instructors looked at us changed, as if we had crossed a line that separated ordinary trainees from something more inconvenient, something that did not fit neatly into the structure they were responsible for maintaining. Rumors began circulating almost immediately, whispered between lockers and half-spoken during late-night shifts, and while most of them tried to cling to the official story of an animal attack, there were variations that slipped through the cracks, mentions of size, of upright movement, of sounds that did not belong to any known species, and every time one of those details surfaced, it was quietly shut down by someone higher up the chain. I started to notice things after that, Small things at first, like how patrol routes near the training ground were altered without explanation, how calls reporting strange noises in industrial zones were reassigned or closed quickly, and how officers who asked too many questions suddenly found themselves transferred, disciplined, or encouraged to take extended leave. One evening, weeks after the incident, I was asked to stay late and help file reports in the same administrative building where we had been questioned, and as I sorted through old cabinets, I found a folder mislabeled and tucked behind outdated training manuals, and inside it were reports that stopped my breath because they described incidents stretching back decades, incidents involving night watchmen, dock workers, and railway inspectors who had reported attacks by something large, upright, and animal in nature. The language was always careful, always evasive, but the patterns were unmistakable, and the locations clustered around the same kinds of spaces: industrial edges, transport hubs, places where the city thinned out, and the rules softened, and I realized then that what we encountered was not an anomaly, it was a recurrence. As I stood there reading, I became aware of a presence behind me, not the creature from that night, but an officer watching me from the doorway, his expression unreadable, and when he spoke he did not ask what I was doing. He simply said that some things are older than departments, older than cities, and that not every threat can be solved with badges and weapons. He told me that what we call monsters are often just survivors, things that adapted to margins humans created and forgot about. And while his words sounded almost philosophical, the fear underneath them was unmistakable, because he was not speaking hypothetically, he was speaking from experience. Before leaving, he took the folder from my hands and told me to forget what I had seen, not as an order, but as advice, and the way he said it made it clear that remembering carried consequences far heavier than discipline or dismissal. That night, as I drove home through streets slick with rain, I saw movement near the edge of the road where warehouses gave way to trees, a tall shape standing just outside the reach of the streetlights, and though it did not move toward me, I felt the same certainty I had felt on the training ground, the certainty of being observed, measured, and allowed to leave. I understood then that the attack had not been random, that our presence had been noticed long before we arrived, and that by surviving, we had become part of a system that depended on silence to function, because the city was not afraid of the werewolf. The city was afraid of admitting it had learned how to live with it. The first of us to break was not the one people expected, because fear does not always choose the weakest voice or the most obvious wound, and when it finally surfaced, it did so quietly, slipping into conversations and routines before anyone recognized it for what it was. He started missing drills, then arriving late, then forgetting procedures he had executed flawlessly for weeks, and when instructors confronted him, he blamed exhaustion, blamed grief, blamed the long nights that followed the incident. But those of us who had been there recognized the look in his eyes, the look of someone who no longer trusted the space around him to remain stable. He told me one night, after most of the building had emptied, that he could still hear it breathing when the lights went out, that no matter where he was, in his apartment, in his car, even in crowded places, the sound returned as soon as silence settled in, steady and close, as if the creature had learned the rhythm of his fear and used it to announce itself. I tried to reassure him in the way we had been taught, reminding him that fear lingers after trauma, that the mind replays threats as a way of protecting itself. But even as I spoke, I felt the hollowness of those words, because what we experienced did not behave like memory, it behaved like surveillance. He stopped sleeping after that, and when sleep finally took him, it came with dreams that bled into waking hours, dreams of standing under streetlights that flickered out one by one, as something tall moved between them. Dreams of radios that only transmitted breathing instead of voices. Dreams of being called by name from the dark, in a voice that sounded almost human. The night he disappeared, no one raised an alarm until morning, because police work teaches you to normalize absence, to assume responsibility before danger. But when his locker remained untouched and his phone went unanswered, a familiar unease settled over those of us who knew better. They said he quit, that he walked away from the program without notice, and that explanation might have held if not for what was found in the alley behind his apartment building: deep gouges in brick at shoulder height, long parallel marks that sank into mortar as if whatever made them had tested the wall for strength. No report mentioned those marks, and when I returned later they were gone, filled and painted over so cleanly that anyone passing would assume nothing had ever happened there. And that was when I understood the system extended far beyond training grounds and files, reaching into neighborhoods, streets, and the places where people live their ordinary lives. After that, the city began to feel smaller, tighter, as if invisible boundaries had been drawn that only some of us could sense. And I noticed how certain areas emptied earlier than others, how people avoided industrial corridors after dark, how patrol cars lingered just long enough to discourage questions, and then moved on. I began carrying my radio even off-duty, not because it made me feel safer, but because silence felt worse. And more than once I caught myself turning suddenly in public spaces, convinced I had heard that breathing again, convinced I was no longer alone even when surrounded by strangers. The worst part was the understanding that came slowly, piece by piece. The understanding that the creature was not roaming blindly, that it was choosing moments and individuals with care, and that those choices followed patterns we were not allowed to discuss. We were not being hunted. We were being managed. The next sighting did not happen on the outskirts of the city or in places people already feared, which is why it could not be dismissed as easily as before. And when the first calls came in, they came fast, overlapping, confused, carrying the unmistakable panic of witnesses who did not yet know how carefully they would be ignored. It was just after midnight near a transit corridor lined with closed warehouses and flickering streetlights, an area busy enough to attract late workers and commuters, quiet enough that screams traveled farther than they should, and by the time patrol units arrived, the scene had already been altered by movement, by people running, by fear scrambling evidence into chaos. Multiple witnesses described the same thing without coordination: a large upright figure crossing the street in 3 strides, its outline briefly illuminated by headlights, its movement smooth and unhurried, and every description included the same detail: the way its head turned as if acknowledging the people watching it, as if it understood it was being seen and did not care. One driver swore it stood taller than his truck. Another said it moved on 2 legs and then dropped briefly to 4 before rising again. And though their accounts varied in language, the core remained consistent, too consistent to be coincidence. And listening to the recordings later made my hands tremble in a way no training could steady. I was not assigned to the call, but I arrived anyway, drawn by a certainty I no longer questioned. And when I stepped out of my car, I felt it immediately. That shift in pressure, that sense of proximity that had nothing to do with distance, and I knew, before anyone said a word, that it had passed through recently. There was blood on the pavement, not much, just enough to suggest injury without confirmation, and I noticed how quickly supervisors moved to contain the area, how efficiently they redirected units and shut down speculation, and how familiar the process felt, as if it had been rehearsed long before this night. A security guard from one of the warehouses was missing, and though his absence was treated with procedural calm, I saw the tension beneath it. The way officers avoided looking toward the darker end of the street, the way radios crackled with updates that never quite answered the questions being asked. Later, as reports were filed and footage reviewed, most of the camera angles were deemed unusable, corrupted, poorly timed, or inconclusive, and the few frames that showed a shape were dismissed as shadows, reflections, or distortion. Explanations offered so quickly they felt prepackaged. Standing there, listening to the city return to its usual rhythm, I realized the truth was no longer hidden because it was unbelievable. It was hidden because acknowledging it would mean admitting that something had been living among us, learning our schedules, exploiting our blind spots, and that we had chosen convenience over confrontation. That night, as I drove home past the transit corridor, I slowed near the stretch where witnesses said it crossed, and for a moment, just a moment, I thought I saw movement beyond the last streetlight, a tall silhouette pausing at the edge of illumination, not threatening, not fleeing, but watching. I did not stop. I did not call it in, because by then I understood the rules better than anyone had ever explained them, and I knew the city was still listening. The truth did not arrive all at once, because truth rarely does when it has been buried by routine and fear. But instead it surfaced in fragments, small inconsistencies that accumulated until denial became harder to maintain than belief. And once that balance tipped, everything I thought I understood about the city began to unravel. It started with paperwork, the kind no one reads closely because it is designed not to invite attention. And as I worked longer hours and gained limited access to archived materials, I noticed patterns that echoed too cleanly to be coincidence. Incidents logged decades apart, yet sharing the same skeletal structure: missing persons near transport corridors, unexplained animal attacks with no confirmed species, witnesses quietly discredited or transferred, and files sealed not for security but for convenience. What disturbed me most was not the presence of these cases, but the tone in which they were written, because the language was calm, almost bored, as if whoever drafted them had already accepted the outcome before the event even occurred. And that realization led me to understand that we were not dealing with a mystery being solved, but with a process being maintained. I found an old report from the early 1940s describing dock workers who claimed something tall and animal had moved through the fog between ships, selecting one man and ignoring the rest. And though the word werewolf never appeared on the page, the descriptions were unmistakable: the upright posture, the elongated arms, the deliberate pace, and the way the event concluded with a single fatality and a rapid return to normal operations. Another file from the 1950s described railway inspectors who reported being followed along a night line by something that matched their speed without effort, only retreating when daylight approached. And the resolution again involved reassignment, silence, and an official explanation that satisfied no one but closed the case. As these fragments accumulated, I began to feel watched even in places that should have been neutral. And though I never saw the creature during those weeks, its absence felt intentional, as if it understood that discovery does not require presence, only memory, and that memory was now spreading. I reached out quietly to one of the remaining recruits, the one who had not disappeared or broken down, and we spoke in guarded tones about what we had found, careful never to use words that could be overheard or documented. And when I showed him copies of the old reports, his face tightened in recognition rather than disbelief, because by then, belief was the only explanation that preserved sanity. He told me he had been followed once after a late shift, not chased, not threatened, but followed at a distance that allowed no confrontation, and that the feeling of being observed had stopped only when he crossed into a brightly lit residential area, as if some boundary had been respected. That detail haunted me because it suggested rules, and rules imply intention, and intention implies something far more dangerous than chaos, because it means the creature was not simply reacting to the city, it was navigating it. The final confirmation came when I found a memo, misfiled and unsigned, that outlined unofficial protocols for handling incidents involving unidentified upright predators. And though the wording avoided specificity, the instructions were chillingly clear: isolate witnesses, control narrative, minimize exposure, and under no circumstances attempt direct engagement unless civilian casualties exceeded acceptable thresholds. Reading that line felt like crossing a line myself, because it meant someone somewhere had decided what number of deaths justified action, and that decision had been made long before we ever stepped onto the training ground. I understood then that the werewolf was not a secret because it was rare, but because it was predictable, and predictability makes systems possible, and systems are easier to defend than truths. Once you see the structure behind a lie, you cannot unsee it, and from that point on, every interaction carried an undercurrent of threat, not from the creature itself, but from the network that existed to keep it unspoken, and that knowledge reshaped the way I moved through the city. I stopped sharing what I knew, even with those I trusted, because trust is fragile when weighed against institutional survival, and I began to understand why the older officers spoke in half sentences and avoided specifics, because ambiguity is a shield that truth does not afford. The recruit who had stayed with me through this process eventually asked the question we had both been avoiding, the question of why the creature tolerated the system at all, why it allowed containment rather than chaos, and though I had no proof, an answer formed in my mind that felt disturbingly accurate. The city fed it. Not intentionally, not through sacrifice or ritual, but through neglect, through margins where people disappeared quietly, where lives intersected with infrastructure rather than community, where a missing person could be explained away as transient, unstable, or irresponsible. And once that framework existed, the creature did not need to hunt recklessly, it only needed to wait. That understanding reframed the training ground attack entirely, because it suggested we were not chosen at random, but selected because we represented disruption, a group of observers entering a controlled space without understanding its rules, and the response had been swift, brutal, and instructive. We were not punished. We were warned. The city responded not by fighting back, but by reinforcing boundaries, adjusting patrols, tightening narratives, and ensuring that what happened to us would not happen in daylight, not in places where too many questions could not be contained. As months passed, I noticed fewer incidents reported near the margins, not because they stopped happening, but because reporting had become more efficient, quieter, almost invisible, and the absence of noise became its own signal. I began to ask myself whether survival was worth the cost of silence, whether knowing the truth obligated me to expose it, and every time that thought surfaced, it was followed by the image of the missing recruits, the erased files, and the undeniable reality that truth without protection becomes another form of sacrifice. The last time I felt the presence of the creature was not during an incident or a chase, but during a moment of stillness, when I stood on an overpass overlooking the industrial corridor at night, and sensed something standing far below, just outside the reach of the lights, not threatening, not retreating, simply existing. For a brief moment, I felt an unsettling clarity, an understanding that the creature and the system surrounding it were reflections of each other, both adapted to survive within the city's blind spots, both dependent on silence, and both protected by the assumption that some truths are too inconvenient to face. I did not feel hatred then. I felt recognition, and that frightened me more than any attack ever could. I did not decide to tell this story all at once, because decisions like that are rarely clean or brave in the moment, but instead it grew out of exhaustion, out of the slow erosion that comes from carrying something heavy for too long without being allowed to set it down. Years passed after the incident, and on paper my career progressed the way it was supposed to. Promotions arrived, responsibilities expanded, and from the outside I became exactly what the department wanted me to be: dependable, quiet, and careful with my words. But beneath that structure, the memory never settled, because memory does not obey hierarchy or time. The city changed around me. Buildings were torn down and rebuilt, corridors were rerouted, and new lights were installed in places that had once been swallowed by darkness. Yet the margins remained, because cities always have margins. Places where people pass through without being seen, places where mistakes disappear instead of being corrected. I encountered the creature one last time, not through sight or sound, but through consequence, when a case crossed my desk involving another missing night worker near the same transit corridor, years apart but structurally identical. And as I read through the report, I felt the same calm efficiency in the language, the same careful avoidance of detail, and I knew with absolute certainty that nothing had changed. That was the moment I understood my role in the system, because by remaining silent, by choosing safety over truth, I had become another layer of insulation between the city and the reality beneath it, and the realization was suffocating, because it meant the monster was no longer just something outside the institution. It was something the institution had adapted around. I considered speaking out formally, filing reports, leaking documents, and forcing the truth into daylight. But every path I examined ended the same way, with denial, discrediting, and quiet removal, and I realized that exposure without understanding would only feed the system rather than break it. So I waited. I waited until enough time had passed that my voice could exist outside official channels, until enough distance separated me from the badge that my words could no longer be framed as instability or grievance, and until technology allowed stories like this to travel without asking permission. I am telling you this now because the creature still exists, not as a myth or a rumor, but as a function of neglect and silence, and because the system that protects it depends on one thing above all else: the assumption that people will look away when the truth feels too heavy to carry. If you take anything from this story, let it be this: monsters do not survive because they are strong, they survive because they are accommodated. And once you see that, you begin to notice them everywhere. What you just heard was not a legend, and it was not a campfire story. It was a pattern, one that repeats itself whenever silence becomes more convenient than truth. If this story stayed with you, if it unsettled you, or if it made you question what hides in the spaces we are taught to ignore, then do not let it end here. Subscribe to this channel, because these stories do not exist to entertain you. They exist because someone lived them and was told to forget. And tell me in the comments what kind of story you want to hear next. Another police case, a military encounter, or something even older that was never meant to survive into the modern world. Because as long as people keep looking away, there will always be something waiting just outside the light.